Alrighty, class. Welcome to class 3, where we're talking this week on evaluations and the law in regards to evaluations for determining initial evals, so initial evaluations, and redetermination for special education services. This week, we're going to be talking about non-discriminatory evaluations, the history of evaluation and inequity. We'll look at not only early intervention placement, but where parents can go for independent evaluations as well. So early intervention, placement evaluations, evaluations in general procedures, as well as reevaluation. I'm just going to talk about the protections that are put in place for the evaluative process overall, and some court cases that actually have created laws to protect both families and students in this process. So the history of special education and education in general in the U.S. Has had a bias towards the over-identification for minority groups for special education services. This is oftentimes due to a misinterpretation of data, and this is, of course, historically due to the individuals in question being compared to peer groups that were not their own peer group. So that's where that bias really came into place over time. But the bias is most often seen in our special education setting during the evaluation process, and especially noting the eligibility piece for special education services and placements when discussing least restrictive environments. The two disabilities, we see a large rise in lack of schooling, both noticing of gaps and lack of response to intervention are two pieces that specifically has jumped out over time. But, this use of incorrect data resulting in discrimination and misclassification of individuals with disabilities has been a big piece that has played into this over time. It's important to note that educational decision-making is something we take for granted now, should not be affected by a child's race, culture, socioeconomic status, or disability. A disproportionate amount, which we'll talk about some of the court cases that played into this in a bit, of both minority and low-income students were labeled with intellectual disabilities, as well as with emotional disabilities. And this was specifically looked at through the 70s. We talked about this the past few weeks, but we looked at our testing. So that's something that's being assessed over time, specifically in the 70s, where finally people started looking at testing, both norm references, test items, determining where bias was evident in these tests and how testing typically reflected only white middle class values and experiences and white middle class cognitive styles of reasoning. So that whole shift at this time of recognizing that these tests are biased towards anyone that is not a white middle class student, number one. Number two, that they were oftentimes only using one test at a time to determine eligibility for special education services for individual students. So this whole shift through the 70s and 80s is where a lot of this took place. It's important to note that no unbiased test currently exists, which is why we need multiple measures. So this whole piece of what we're talking about when we think about testing for students to determine eligibility services for special education, that is why we talk about needing to have multiple measures when determining a student for special education services. So some tests are more biased than others. You'll have a chance to look at this week for your assignment, and you'll be able to look at it through a lens on bias. So really kind of focusing on, well, where could a specific test lean towards maybe over identifying a student, and these tests actually explicitly say this in their instruction manual, so you'll be able to see that this week. But really, kind of talking about how these biases in education can pop up, and again, over-identification of individuals with disabilities really ends up being with a lack of response intervention for these students, and we'll talk about how RTI ties directly into this evaluation process as well. But for this week, your journal entry, what you'll be doing is looking into how biased testing can be for students. what I want you to do is identify a test that either you use regularly within your district or district you have worked in. You might have to talk to some people if you are not someone that is testing regularly or has ever tested anyone. For those of you that have not been in classrooms or even have been in a school setting, you'll have to do a little legwork on this. You may have to do a little bit of light Googling as well. But you're going to be looking through the technical manual for these tests. Every test has one, where there be information about test biases. Identify the test biases that this test acknowledges, and then note what population this test was norm referenced using, and what populations this test would be appropriate to use with. So please note, obviously, which populations this test or the test that you choose would have cultural, linguistic, or other biases towards, and therefore would not be applicable to use that for. So if you're not in a district or don't have access to testing manuals, which I understand some of you do not, you can do this through a Google search. What do I recommend Google searching for this? If you think about it for a few minutes, this is something I think you should be able to do in this course. Possibly Googling common educational tests used for assessment in special education. That might get you some things. Find a category and see if there are some tests here that you may have heard of. Typically, this will be 1 to 2 pages. Shouldn't need to go much more in that, but definitely not much less. And I also added on for you the mental measurement scale. You could use the local library as well as the same state library has access to a few tests as well. But the mental measurement scale is a handbook that evaluates every test under the sun pretty much. It's a fascinating book, but all testing in special education will be evaluated in that book. So check that out. I have a link there for you. It could be a good resource for you moving forward as well in your education careers. But if you're not someone that, uses that type of testing, again, I would just Google common educational tests used for assessments in special education. That'll get you a laundry list of them. But if you still get stuck in finding them, please reach out to me. I'm happy to help. So going forward, talking about non-discriminatory evaluations, and let's pick up. I know I do a lot of review so far in the first few weeks of this course where, I talk about a court case in one class and then I bring it back in the next, but I think it's important, again, for us to focus on our foundation and level of comfort, with all of our court cases that we've been talking about. So after 1954 and the Brown Board versus Education, many school systems really attempted to slow down desegregation, or so they thought, through using standardized testing as a measure to do that. But what ended up happening for many of these schools in using standardized testing, what happened was that students were placed actually in separate schools due to testing, and they were put in various tracks, lower tracks and higher tracks based on how they performed on certain tests, which led to a case called Hobson versus Hansen in 1967, where students were tracked and over the majority of students, or both minority students as well as some students in the lower socioeconomic status, were put into lower tracks and school settings and subsequently given worse curriculum. And this was found unconstitutional. And we talked about Hobson and Hansen a few weeks back, but it brought a lot of truths to light. This case took place in Washington, D.C., and these students that I mentioned before were placed in lower tracks and were given different curriculum than students that were placed in the higher tracks based on their testing they were given. So these students found they were not given access to the same curriculum as their same age peers, and the Supreme Court found that they were eligible for compensatory services over time. Similarly, in Larry P. versus Riles, students were given biased tests and placed away from the rest of the school population. These tests were normed against white middle-class students, and they found a disproportionate amount of minority students were being referred for special education in this time. These students, and again, at this time, this was, we now understand this to be, not an appropriate phrase, but at that time, they were referred for the educable mentally retarded class, so a specific track that they had there in their school setting, and they found that not only were they receiving less curriculum, less robust curriculum than their peers, but they did find too that there was a stigma and a label on this class or on this group setting that they were in, that they found once they left that class that they were less likely to get jobs in their environment as well. So it was found unconstitutional and due to what their access to free and appropriate publication should be at that time. And they found through this that they had to retest students. They were mandated by the course to retest students, and were given access to not only their developmental health history screenings and adaptive behavior observations, but diagnostic testing. So they were forced by the schools to do more testing for them. Last up, 1980, Pace versus Hansen. This was really all about bias testing and non-discriminatory evaluations. This took place in Chicago public schools using IQ tests, specifically the WISC test, the Wechsler Intelligence Student Scale, the Wechsler Intelligence Student Scale Revised Test, as well as the Stanford Binet IQ test. And they found through this, the Supreme Court found that although there were biased questions in these tests, they found out that they were overall fair. The IQ test was not used as the sole basis for placement. So placement was not discriminatory in nature, that was found. And the Chicago Public Schools actually won this case, but it brought this whole idea of using multiple measures to light, as well as the idea that yes, some of these tests can be biased, towards different individual students. So moving forward, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act states that we must provide students with an appropriate diagnosis, program planning, and educational placement through non-discriminatory assessment. So again, don't miss kind of the goals of this class. We're talking all about evaluations and through the lens of talking about the process of what is put into place by a lot of the laws we talked about in the first class. Okay, so don't forget about those as all of people are starting to grow programs and create tests and assess how to treat people fairly and equitably in school settings. Where many schools were trying to build the plane as they fly it. So I think it's important to keep that noted kind of in the back of your mind as we're going throughout this course. But testing and evaluation material must not be racially or culturally discriminatory. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act also stated that test evaluations must be in their native language. They have to be validated. They have to be given by validated for the purpose for which they are used, administered by trained personnel, and administered according to the instructions in the assessment. So those are very clear pieces that go along with testing and evaluation baseline. So you have to use multiple assessments. When working with students, no single test can be used for determining educational programming. You have to use a variety of assessments. Evaluation must include an assessment in all areas related to a suspected disability and aptitude and achievement levels. All information obviously must be documented, and all results need to be written up both and summarized both for professionals and families throughout the process. So in evaluations, there must be a notice to a parent about the evaluation procedures and what testing is going to be conducted for that student. There must be a notice to them. They need to be aware of the process and procedures. They need to be aware of who is conducting the assessment and why. It's important we have parental input at the table when we're determining eligibility for the students. So that is why it's important not only to include them, but also to share. They might have further input that they might not see in school settings. And again, we have to use technically sound instruments, so a variety of testing tools as well. In terms of reevaluation, so let's we're talking a lot right now about initial evaluation, but if a student's being reevaluated for educational services or special educational services, that reevaluation process legally must take place every 3 years. So you might see that word reeval or reevaluation thrown around a lot in the special education world. That just means that eligibility is determined every 3 years to make sure that a student is still requiring those services, and that usually goes in conjunction with their 1 year progress meeting. So what you do is every year the IEP, individual education plan, is rewritten for updated goals essentially. And then a 3-year reeval, which does involve testing, is done every 3 years. That's the short version of it, which we'll get more into later. So talking more about the initial evaluation specifically in Massachusetts, a student can be referred by a parent, a caregiver, or professional concerned with a student's development. So any one of those individuals can refer that student. When referred for an initial evaluation, the school district must send a written notice to the student's parents within 5 school days of receipt of the referral. That's important. That's a legal mandate. The school has 5 days once that initial referral is put in. This document obviously is going to seek consent for a parent for the evaluation to occur for that child and allow parents really to express their concerns, their initial assessment concerns on that student from the get-go. So school districts need to provide the student's parents with an opportunity to consult with the special education administrator to talk about the reason for the referral, the content of the proposed evaluation, and who will actually do that evaluation. It's important to note as well, I know we talk about Part B of IDEA. We did that in the first week. But with a referral for school districts, let's talk about, a school district might have to evaluate a child that's 2.5 years or older who may be receiving special services through an early intervention program. An initial evaluation is conducted so that if eligible, special education services can promptly begin at 3, because we talked about, again, Part B and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act deals with a student from ages 3 to 21. So that's when the individual family service plan would no longer be in effect once they hit 3. So that is why you see some services for early intervention. That process would start at 2.5, so they're ready to go right when that student hits 3 years old. So in terms of required assessments in Massachusetts, so all federal law says is you need to assess a student in all areas related to a suspected disability. But in Massachusetts, much like many other sides we've talked about so far, they're a bit more specific on what is required in terms of an evaluation process. So what includes in Massachusetts is a history of the student's educational progress in the general curriculum or environment, an assessment of the student's attention skills, participation behaviors, communication skills, memory, social relations with groups, peers, and adults. The school district should also evaluate and provide a narrative description of a student's educational and developmental potential. This is typically done by a cumulative review of what has been done in the past for the student as well, when appropriate, and where we expect progression over time for that student. When a child is being assessed to determine eligibility for services at age 3, an observation of the child's interactions in the child's natural environment or early intervention program is strongly encouraged. That early intervention piece is key, so that's typically where this would be done, but you could include home in the evaluation process as well. So, if it's appropriate to see a student at their home for the process of the evaluation, you can do so. For children receiving early intervention services, school districts are encouraged to use current and appropriate assessments, obviously, from early intervention teams. And the big piece here, too, is to avoid duplicate testing. I see this a lot with students who might be switching districts. Oftentimes, a test could be done in one location, and through some miscommunication, a test could be done. The exact same test might be done a few months later. This is not only can be really taxing for the student, but could also, really set them back in terms of getting the services they need quicker. So that's important to avoid duplicate testing in education and evaluation determination. And again, psychological health and home assessments might also be used on a case-by-case basis when appropriate. So moving forward, talking about early intervening services. So this, really got off the ground through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 2004. But the whole goal was for a call for response to intervention, or RTI, as the phrase is used, to catch students really before they fail at the end of the day. So prior to 2004, typically it was, waiting for students to fail. And this whole goal now is to prevent academic problems and catch them before learning deficits occur. So this is not necessarily to refer students for special education, but many times students were being referred to special education, when all they may have needed, they maybe did not have a disability, but all they needed was a little bit of RTI, response intervention, early on, and they could have been, able to make progress. But we found this over-identification in special education for students who just needed some, limited services when they were younger. So 15% of IDEA funding could be used for that. So there was federal dollars set aside for for these early intervention services for these students and for schools to use. And as part of this, it really was all about funding this multi-tiered system of support for these students in these school settings. So instead of having a waiting to fail model, we really started switching to response to intervention and really trying to catch students before learning deficits occur. So students were not getting appropriate supports early enough, it was found. And so, why wait for a gap to be large enough before we do something? So really, it was shown that early intervening leads to long-term success, which is why RTI became a part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 2004. For the students you intervene with and try to teach a skill one way, obviously, and you intervene again and attempt to teach a skill another way, you may find over time that they actually do have a learning disability and do need special education support services. But RTI can help support program implementation and services for these students. So in some ways too, it's also important to note that second, note there that determining students with learning disabilities, this could also help the process because you're starting it earlier for many of these students. So students who need long-term special education service supports, you might be able to flag that earlier now due to RTI being embedded in school settings. So what does RTI look like? There should be a review for most of you that have taken education courses before, but students should be taught by highly qualified teachers using research-based instruction. And in the general education setting, that is important. Teachers, again, the response to intervention process, there should be universal screenings of academics and behavior, so they know where all students in the class are performing at a curriculum-based measured skill. For students not hitting benchmarks, you can move from small group to small group instruction with intervention services. These individuals with small group instruction have progress monitoring taking place. So again, going from a larger group setting to small group instruction. Again, same curriculum. These individuals will have that progress monitoring taking place in that small group to know if small group intervention is working for that student. If the student has plateaued, let's say in a small group setting, we know the intervention is not working and we may need to try something else. Some students will be fine with just a little bit of small group work. And then, no further, I keep talking about the continuum of services for students, but no further intervention might be needed. So it's important for you to know that there are many opportunities through, implementing services for students before we get to referring for special education services that can really impact students. So, if the student is making progress, then we know it's working. So really, you're constantly assessing intervention effectiveness over time through regular progress monitoring. Going forward and kind of showing you the response to intervention RTI model, it's just a really nice clean graphic for that. But tier 1 of RTI is screening everyone in your class. So you do a universal screening and benchmarking all students. You want to know, how your students that do not meet grade level benchmark will be identified as needing small group intervention or instruction in tier 2. So we progress monitor to see if tier 2, if students are gaining the skill over time in that small group piece that they were not at grade level or benchmarking at. If students plateau, we'll try a different intervention. You might need to switch to not only a child to student services, usually either called child study or student service teams in school settings. They're named differently in different districts, but at this point, a student will request support from, or you would get support for the student through other professionals, educators, administrators, to see what interventions you would attempt to implement for the student in tier 3. And at this, after you've tried all of these intervention techniques for the student, you figured out where they were in relation to their peers in their classroom setting. You tried small group work with progress monitoring. In tier 3, you had other diagnostic testing and intensive progress monitoring solutions available for the student. If you as a professional at this point, as a classroom teacher or a special or educator, in a school setting that does RTI services for students, you would have all the data you need to refer that student for special education evaluation. You should never be going right to special education evaluation. For the most part, for a student that is, in a general education classroom, typically you try all these intervention techniques first. And then once you refer that student for special education evaluation, then you would enable the referral process that we talked about earlier, where you would have the parents would have 5 days to get that referral process letter. So that's the process in terms of getting referred to start the process for special education services. So switching gears from the response to intervention process, we're going on to evaluation timelines. So when the parent receives a referral within 5 days in writing, they have to sign off on that referral so that testing can be done for the student. Once a parent signs off on the referral that was sent to them, that again was given to them within 5 days, the referral being made. So it's kind of a notice of referral or notice of testing. The schools have 60 days to do testing and have a meeting to discuss the educational needs of that child. You must have parental consent before any evaluation can be conducted. This is true for both initial evaluations and reevals. And if parents do not provide consent, schools can use procedural safeguard guidelines to pursue their request for an initial evaluation. There's a few court cases that called into question these timelines over time. Some things we honestly take for granted now, in a sense, but I think it's important to flag why we have the process we do at this time. So there's the Quakenbush versus Johnson City School District. So that's 1983. Literally, a school district checked off a box that they told the parent they would not do. So parents were given the referral and asked for testing to be done. When the school district came to the parents, they asked the parents to sign the form, and they told the parents that they would literally check the box off for them. So it's kind of like filling out a blank check. They said they would fill out the box for them, and the school district actually checked the wrong box on purpose. It was found. The Supreme Court found that the school district was in violation. They checked off that the parents didn't want testing, even though they did. They had to provide. The Supreme Court found they had to provide compensatory services for that student. It was in 1983. In 1994, the Gerstmeyer versus Howard County Public Schools case, the parent requested testing for the student. The school district said that they had no one to test in the summer. They said they do not do testing during the summertime. The Supreme Court found, obviously, that they still had to do testing within 60 days. Because they did not do that, they had to provide compensatory services for that student. So again, this is something where just because you're on summer break doesn't mean you cannot test a student for special education services. Except 2001, Great Valley District versus Sean. So there was a student with behavioral challenges, and the family decided they wanted a unilateral placement in California. They were originally from Pennsylvania. And the student, so when it was time for reevaluation, they wanted the Pennsylvania school district to fly to California to do the testing. Seems ridiculous, I know. The Supreme Court said that that was not necessary. So this is one where they signed it with the school district. They said the parents could either choose to pay for an independent evaluation or fly that child back to get testing done in Pennsylvania. 2001, Bear versus Claggles. Each state can decide when to give evaluation reports to parents. So that can be before the IEP meeting or at it. So that was what was decided in that case. Obviously not after. So it has to be either before the IEP meeting or physically at the meeting is where they can do that. So moving on to current evaluation. So the 60-day time frame allows for testing data to be both current and informative when identifying the least restrictive environment for a student's educational program. So a few important court cases that came up in this, the Bonadonna case, this old. So what they did was they actually created versus Cooperman old data was used to actually create the IEP for the student. So they had inappropriate programming created for the student based on old testing data that they had. So obviously we know now, that's why there's that 60-day time window. The Supreme Court upheld that and said they weren't in compliance with the 60-day time frame. So therefore they needed to provide more services. The Holland versus District of Columbia Schools, 1995. Parents asked which evaluations were to be conducted. Without knowing this, they would not sign off on testing. The school district did not actually respond to the parents' inquiry, and the child was not evaluated for 9 months. This Supreme Court again found the school district was not in compliance with the 60-day time frame, and again, compensatory services were given to that student. In Massachusetts, families actually have the right, they need to know who is actually providing the testing. That's an important distinction between, federal and or other states really, and Massachusetts, is that parents have the right to know who that is, or they are legally mandated to know the right who is actually doing the testing. So they need to be told what tests and who are going to be conducting the tests. And if independent assessments are made on behalf of like the family for that student. So if, let's say a family wants to go pay for a test to be done and brought to the IEP, then they have to be considered legally at the table during the IEP meeting. That is very common. Families do pay for outside services to conduct testing. That could be for many reasons. Sometimes they feel like the people at the school don't have their best interests in mind. Sometimes they just do want more testing to be more thorough. There could be many reasons for that. So let's talk about the IEP team. So who actually should be in this meeting for the student? So a team must be involved in an initial evaluation and as a part of both as the reevaluation as well. So who is required on team membership? That's the parents or guardians of the child with a disability. We talked a little about that a few weeks ago. At least one general education teacher, if the child is or may be participating in the general education environment, at least one special education teacher, a representative from the local education agency, that could be from above, a person, maybe someone again from above, to interpret testing results. So who's actually going to share what the testing results were for that student, related service personnel as appropriate, and the child with a disability when appropriate can be at that meeting as well, and can also advocate for themselves when appropriate. So what does the team do? So the team at this meeting, they're going to review existing evaluation data. They identify if additional data may be needed. So if so, they need to come up with a plan to gather that data, whether that's more testing, et cetera, and a timeline. Determine if the child has a disability and if the disability is the reason for lack of progress in schooling and therefore needs specialized instruction curriculum modifications. They need to identify and actually communicate about the present levels of academic performance and achievement and the needs of that child. And if accommodations or modifications are needed to allow for the child to meet those measurable annual goals that we talked about, then they need to talk about what accommodations are appropriate, modifications are appropriate for that student to make progress in a classroom setting. And they explicitly talk about all these things with the student when appropriate. They talk about them with the family when appropriate, and guardians as well. So talking about independent educational evaluations, parents have the right to have independent educational evaluations completed and reviewed. That obviously begs the question, if they have the right to do that, well, who pays for that independent evaluation? If the district requests it, so let's say the district requests any portion of it. Seals versus Loftus was 1985 when this is one where the district needed more evaluation done and they did an independent evaluation process. So the district had to pay. If the district used the result from that independent evaluation, let's say they did another one, Raymond versus Mariers in 1996, the district actually used results from an independent investigation evaluation. The district was responsible for paying. And in some cases, so if the district did not provide a comprehensive evaluation and the parents had to go seek an independent evaluator out, let's say, the district was completely off base, they didn't give a full battery of tests that were in line with the students' needs in a classroom setting. This is where a family could go get an independent evaluation that clearly shows that that student needed that evaluation done, and then the district would be on the hook for that payment. So just some important pieces about the independent, educational evaluation process and where money could be drawn there for that. So talking about minimum competency testing. So this is really at the end of the day, tying high school graduation, high school diplomas to state testing. I think you're going to be seeing many more cases of this going forward in the next few years, especially, post-COVID, if you will. But I think these will pop up a lot more. It first started way back in 1981. I think it's important for you to get an understanding of the foundation of where these cases really came from. But it's a Florida case that challenged state testing that had a greater impact on Black students than it did white students at this time. So more than double or triple of individuals that were not meeting graduation requirements due to state testing. or Black students than white students, in this case down in Florida. And Deborah P. won against Florida and was not allowed to tie state testing at this time to obtaining a high school diploma. It was a violation of rights. In 1984, Florida flip-flopped here, and the state, they said they could use test results and provide remedial instruction to those that first fail a test. So if you fail the test, they said, you can keep tying testing data to, you have to pass the test to get your high school diploma. But what happened was they said, okay, we're just going to provide you with remedial instruction. We'll put in supports. You can retake the test. So therefore, they could now tie it back to that graduation requirement. Because there was that safety net allowing students to retake the test, they overturned that original decision from 1981. And they had the SAT 2 that they were using down there. So it could be linked to graduation. Next up, Brookhart versus Illinois State Board of Education, 1983. They said this one testing procedure should be validated and no decision should be made on one test alone. The court held, in this case, upheld the minimum competency testing. And really, I think you're going to see these three cases used as groundwork. What we're seeing now, we're going to be seeing more cases popped up about, the biases in testing, especially tying state testing to graduation requirements. So a little more about state and district-wide assessments. So before 1997, many students with disabilities were not included in testing, and these scores were not actually reported. This, left education at this time in really a weird place. People were asking, well, how do we know what you're doing with these students if we have no broad testing data? Are you just babysitting them? Are they getting a robust curriculum? How are we going to know? How can we assess what you're teaching these students, this whole population of students, if we don't have any big data on it? So I get that, I get that whole conversation here. Low expectations asked the students due to stereotyping. So in IDEA 2004, students were asked to participate in large-scale state testing assessments. Students must participate at this time in district and statewide assessments with or without accommodations. So students do have accommodations in state testing or alternative assessments. And there's actually a number percentage on that. In Massachusetts, you cannot have more than 1% of students go through alternative assessments. That's a messy process, and one that I'm heavily involved in myself day to day. I do all digital testing at my school setting, and I work in a school that has alternative assessments. And that process from the state level is an interesting process that is not one that's part of this course. But if state testing interests you, there's a lot you can look into with that. But now we must report all numbers. In testing, you must report the number of students with disabilities who participated in regular assessments, the number who were provided accommodations, and the number of students participating in alternative assessments. You should do that from the get-go when you're signing up for testing for that year. And really, this was now used to say, well, are you making progress from year to year? There's now at least some data on that. So moving forward, the assignment along with the discussion post I talked about previously, you're going to find a course folder called FAPE Case Study. What you're going to be doing is you're going to be reading through this case, getting background information on it, as well as both parents and districts' positions on this case. There are 5 embedded questions in this. The questions to be answered by the hearing officer. They're laid out there in there. And you're going to be playing, kind of looking through the lens of the hearing officer in this case. So we talked about FAPE last week, but those are the questions I want you to respond to for that assignment. You're really going to be using everything you've learned so far about special education law to answer this case study and answer those 5 questions in there, as well as bring in the data presented in the case to construct your answers to those questions. If you have any questions as you're plugging away on that assignment, please let me know. Next class, we're going to be talking about program development, construction of the IEP, so what it actually looks like, IEP litigation, what appropriate services are, appropriate placements, again, that loose term there, appropriate, SMART goal creation and measured progress, as well as annual testing.